There are ancient images that should not exist, not because they are old, because they look wrong. Wrong for their time, wrong for the world that created them, wrong in a way that hits instantly before anyone has explained a thing. A figure seated like a pilot, a carving that looks less like a god and more like an astronaut. Ancient descriptions of flying craft moving through the sky. A stone image that seems to show a machine, not a myth. A figure that looks like it is wearing a helmet, a mask or some kind of suit. And once you see them, really see them, they stop feeling like ordinary relics. They start to feel like evidence. That is why these images have never gone away. Because they do not just look strange, they look familiar. Familiar in the worst possible way. Like things the ancient world was never supposed to know. For decades, people have stared at these carvings, reliefs, figurines and cave paintings, and asked the same question. What if the ancients were not imagining gods at all? What if they were recording something they had actually seen? Something mechanical, something intelligent, something not from here. That is the hook that never dies. Because some of these images do not merely suggest mystery, they suggest contact. A king on a stone lid who looks like he is operating a craft. Egyptian reliefs that seem to resemble aircraft. Ancient texts describing vehicles in the sky. Figures that look like they were carved from memory, not imagination. Objects and symbols that feel less like ritual and more like technology frozen in stone. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to shake the feeling that these are not isolated oddities. They come from different civilizations, different centuries, different continents, and yet they keep pulling the imagination toward the same possibility. That long before the modern age, before rockets, before flight, before science fiction, someone saw something impossible, something that looked like it had come from the sky, and then carved it into history. That is where this story begins. Not with proof, with images. Ancient, silent, unchanging images that still look like they came from somewhere beyond Earth. If there is one image that ancient alien theorists return to more than almost any other, it is this one. A stone carving from the ancient Maya world that at first glance looks less like a burial scene and more like a man operating some kind of machine. It is usually called the Palenque Astronaut. And once you see it, it becomes very difficult to forget because it does not look like what most people expect ancient art to look like. It looks technical, mechanical, purposeful. A body leaning forward. Hands positioned in ways that seem deliberate. Feet placed as if they are pressing something. Flames, exhaust, or some kind of force appearing below. And a structure around the figure that many people say resembles the inside of a craft. To understand why it became so powerful, you have to begin with the place it came from. The carving was found at Palenque, an ancient Maya city in what is now Chiapas, southern Mexico. Palenque flourished during the classic Maya period, especially between the 6th and 8th centuries AD. It was not a primitive outpost. It was a sophisticated city-state of temples, inscription, kingship, ritual, and dynastic memory. The Maya who built Palenque were literate, mathematically advanced, astronomically attentive, and deeply invested in recording lineage and cosmic order. The carving itself is located on the lid of a sarcophagus inside the Temple of the Inscriptions, one of the most important structures at Palenque. And the figure shown on it is almost certainly Kinich Janab Pakal I, usually known simply as Pakal the Great. Pakal was one of the most important rulers in Palenque's history. He was born in 603 AD, came to the throne in 615 AD, and ruled until his death in 683 AD. Under Pakal, Palenque expanded, rebuilt, and strengthened itself politically and architecturally. He was not a minor noble attached to a random artifact. He was the central king of a major Maya city. Pakal's tomb was one of the great archaeological discoveries of ancient Mesoamerica. It was uncovered in 1952 by Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz Luille, who found a hidden stairway descending deep into the Temple of the Inscriptions. At the bottom of that stairway was the burial chamber, and within it, Pakal's stone sarcophagus. That alone tells you this was not casual decoration. This was royal funerary art on a monumental scale. The lid of the sarcophagus is enormous, carved in intricate relief. And at the center is Pakal. Or at least, that is the mainstream archaeological reading. Because from the moment modern audiences began seeing photographs of the carving, another interpretation started creeping in. The image does not strike the modern eye as still or ceremonial. It feels active. Pakal appears tilted forward, almost as if seated in motion. His hands seem positioned in front of him in ways that some compare to operating controls. One foot appears angled downward, as though pressing something. Below him are shapes that, to ancient astronaut theorists, resembled jets, flames, or propulsion. Around him are curving forms that look uncannily like machinery, tubing, or a cockpit frame. And this is where the modern mythology of the image really begins. Because in the 1960s and 70s, writers such as Erich von Daniken helped make this carving globally famous by arguing that it looked exactly like what it seemed to show. A human figure seated inside an advanced craft. In that reading, Pakal is not a Maya king in a symbolic ritual scene. He is a pilot, or perhaps a passenger. The machine around him is some kind of spacecraft. The forms below are exhaust or rocket flame. His posture is not spiritual, it is technical, operational. A man flying. That interpretation exploded because it was visual. You didn't need to know Maya religion to feel the impact of it. You only had to look. People saw a seated figure, a machine-like frame, apparent controls, apparent propulsion. And the ancient astronaut theory suddenly had one of its most iconic images. This is why the Palenque lid became so important. Not because it proved anything definitively, but because it looked like proof. But the mainstream archaeological reading is very different. To Maya scholars, this is not a spaceship scene at all. It is a royal funerary cosmological image, packed with religious symbolism. In the conventional interpretation, Pakal is shown in relation to the world tree, the axis linking the underworld, the earthly realm, and the heavens. What looks mechanical to modern eyes is, in that reading, symbolic, cosmic, mythological. That is the core rebuttal, and it is a strong one, because once you study Maya iconography more broadly, the Palenque lid stops looking isolated. The themes of sacred trees, celestial imagery, underworld symbolism, and royal transformation appear elsewhere in Maya art and religion. So the disagreement is not over whether the carving is real. It is real. The disagreement is over what kind of image it is. Ancient astronaut theorists say it looks too technical to be symbolic. Archaeologists say modern viewers are projecting rockets, cockpits, and machines onto an ancient funerary image. And that is where the debate becomes genuinely interesting, because both sides are reacting to the same truth. The image is extraordinarily structured. The hard evidence is this: it is authentic. It comes from a real tomb. It depicts a real king. It belongs to a real Maya city. It was created around the time of Pakal's death in 683 AD. It is not a modern hoax. The question is not whether it is fake. The question is what it means. Who carved it? Almost certainly highly skilled Maya artisans working in the royal and ritual sphere of Palenque, likely under the authority of Pakal's successors, especially his son, Erich Kanbalam II. Why carve it? In the mainstream view, to place Pakal inside a sacred cosmological framework tied to death, transformation, and rebirth. In the ancient alien view, to depict something remembered, something seen, something that, in another age, we would call technology. And that is why the image still survives as one of the great battlegrounds between archaeology and conspiracy. One side sees symbol, religion, kingship, rebirth. The other sees machine, pilot, contact, memory. Maybe that is why it remains so powerful, because it doesn't just support a theory, it invites one. It is an ancient object that feels modern in exactly the wrong way. A king in a tomb who, at first glance, looks like he is seated inside something he should never have known how to imagine. And whether that means the Maya encoded cosmic symbolism or something much stranger, the effect is the same. You look at it, and the question arrives almost instantly: why does this look like an astronaut? If there is one ancient image that has gone viral more than almost any other in the modern conspiracy age, it is this one. A carved section of Egyptian hieroglyphs that at first glance appears to show something impossible. A helicopter, and not just a helicopter. Depending on who is looking, the same cluster of shapes has also been said to resemble a submarine, a jet aircraft, or some kind of advanced flying machine. That is why it became famous. Because unlike many ancient mysteries, this one does not require much explanation to spark a reaction. You look at it, and for a moment, it seems obvious. How could an ancient Egyptian temple wall contain something that looks so much like modern technology? The image is found at Abydos, one of the most important sacred sites in ancient Egypt. Abydos is located in Upper Egypt, west of the Nile, and for thousands of years it held immense religious significance, especially in connection to the cult of Osiris, god of the dead and the underworld. This was not a fringe site. It was one of the great ceremonial and dynastic centers of Egyptian civilization. The carving in question is located in the temple of Seti I, one of the most impressive pharaonic temples at Abydos. Seti I ruled during the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom, around 1290 to 1279 BC. He was the father of Ramesses II, later known as Ramesses the Great. The temple itself was a royal monument, rich in inscription, reliefs, ritual scenes, and dynastic statements. Like the Palenque lid, this matters, because whatever the helicopter image is, it comes from a real monument created in a highly sophisticated culture under royal authority in one of the best-known civilizations of the ancient world. The specific carving appears high on a stone beam or architrave within the temple. And this is where the modern fascination begins. Because when photographs of it spread, especially in the late 20th century, and then across the internet, people became fixated on the apparent shapes. One of them looks startlingly like a helicopter. There appears to be a long body, something like a cockpit, and a shape above that resembles rotor blades. Next to it, depending on how the eye reads the damaged forms, other figures seem to resemble a submarine or a kind of aircraft fuselage. This is why ancient astronaut theorists latched onto it so quickly. The image requires almost no setup. It feels visual, direct. You don't need to know Egyptian religion or language to understand the claim being made. The claim is obvious, that the ancient Egyptians carved modern technology into stone, and from there, the theory expands. Some say the image is proof that ancient civilizations had access to advanced knowledge lost to history. Others push further, suggesting it records contact with non-human visitors, or that ancient Egypt was exposed to technologies that should not have existed in the 2nd millennium BC. That is the ancient alien interpretation. Simple, visual, and immediately compelling. But in this case, the mainstream explanation is not only strong, it is very specific. According to Egyptologists and epigraphers, the helicopter is not a single original image at all. It is a palimpsest. That means one inscription was carved first, and then later another inscription was carved over the top of it. Over time, as plaster, stone, and surface details eroded, the two layers partially merged, creating composite shapes that now look to modernize like machines. This is the core of the debunk. Under Seti I, one set of hieroglyphs was cut. Later, during the reign of Ramesses II, a new inscription was placed over the earlier one. The old carving was filled and plastered over, then recut with fresh royal titulary. As the surface weathered and degraded over centuries, fragments from both texts remain visible at once. The result is not one coherent image of a helicopter. It is two different layers of writing interfering with each other visually. That matters because once you know that, the mystery changes. It stops being, how did the Egyptians know what a helicopter looked like? And becomes, why does accidental overlap create such a convincing illusion? That is actually a fascinating question in its own right, because the helicopter survives not because it is a strong historical argument, but because it is a powerful visual coincidence. And the human brain is built to latch onto patterns, especially familiar ones. If you live in a modern world full of helicopters, jets, submarines, and machines, your eye will find them quickly when the stone gives you even a rough outline. That is exactly what seems to be happening here. And yet, the image still survives in public imagination. Why? Because even once the explanation is given, the first impression does not disappear. The shape still hits. It still looks wrong. It still produces that instant reaction. How can this be there? That is why Abydos remains important to this kind of story. Not because it is the strongest evidence for ancient advanced technology. It probably isn't. But because it is one of the clearest examples of how little it takes for a visual anomaly to become a global mystery. And it shows something important about these debates. Sometimes the power of an image is not in what it proves. It is in how quickly it bypasses reason and lands in the imagination. The hard facts are these. The carving is real. It is in the temple of Seti I at Abydos in Upper Egypt. The temple dates to the 13th century BC. The suspicious shapes are almost certainly the product of overlapping inscriptions from the reigns of Seti I and Rameses II. The image is not a modern fake, but it is also not, in the mainstream reading, a deliberate depiction of aircraft. The question is what we are really looking at. Ancient alien theorists say the resemblance is too strong to ignore. Egyptologists say it is a trick of stone, erosion, and layered text. Both are reacting to the same thing. An image that looks impossibly modern, and perhaps that is why the Abydos helicopter remains so effective. It is not a rich cosmological scene like Palenque. It does not need a huge amount of interpretation. It is simpler than that. A visual shock, a split-second collision between the ancient world and the modern eye. One of those rare images that makes people stop, stare, and ask whether history has just shown them something it was never supposed to contain. And even if the answer is no, the impact remains. Because once you have seen a helicopter in an Egyptian temple, it is very hard to stop seeing it. If Palenque gives you a king who looks like a pilot, and Abydos gives you a carving that seems to show a machine, then the Vimanas give you something even more provocative. Ancient descriptions of craft in the sky. Not one image, not one relief, but entire stories and texts that seem to describe flying vehicles, aerial movement, and even battles above the earth. That is why the Vimanas remain one of the most powerful parts of the ancient alien theory. Because here, the mystery is not carved in stone, it is written. The word Vimana comes from ancient Sanskrit. It appears in the great Indian epics, especially the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, texts rooted in ancient traditions stretching back into the first millennium BC and shaped over centuries of oral and written development. And inside those texts are descriptions that have fascinated modern readers ever since. The most famous example is the Pushpaka Vimana, a vehicle associated with Ravana, the king of Lanka, and later used by Rama. It is described as a craft that could move through the sky, carry passengers, travel great distances, and operate with a freedom that feels shockingly advanced for the ancient world. That alone is enough to trigger modern imagination. An ancient text describing a flying craft, a royal or divine vehicle crossing the heavens. And in the Mahabharata, the imagery becomes even more intense. There are descriptions that some readers interpret as aerial warfare, radiant weapons, destructive force from above, and motion through the sky that feels far closer to machinery than mythology. That is the ancient alien reading. That the Vimanas were not symbolic chariots at all, but remembered technology, machines, aircraft, possibly advanced vehicles seen by ancient people and preserved in epic language long after their true origin had been forgotten. And that is why this chapter hits so hard. Because unlike Abydos, this is not one visual coincidence. And unlike Palenque, it is not one image that happens to look mechanical. Here, the theory is built on repeated ancient descriptions of flight itself. That is the core of the ancient alien claim. Now, the mainstream explanation is much simpler. Most historians and Sanskrit scholars argue that Vimanas are mythological or divine vehicles within epic literature. Not machines in the modern sense, but sacred chariots, symbolic conveyances, and part of the elevated cosmology of ancient Indian storytelling. That is the main debunk, and it is a strong one. But even with that explanation in place, the question remains, why do these ancient descriptions of skyborne vehicles, aerial movement, and impossible craft still sound so strangely modern? And why, thousands of years later, do the Vimanas still feel less like old myth and more like something hovering just beyond explanation? The so-called Dendera light is one of the most famous images in all of ancient technology theory, because at first glance, it does not look like ritual art. It looks like a machine. The relief is found at the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, in Upper Egypt, on the west bank of the Nile, around 60 kilometers north of Luxor. Dendera was an important religious center for thousands of years, but the temple complex most visitors see today belongs largely to the late Ptolemaic period, with construction continuing into the Roman era. That places the surviving reliefs broadly between the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, although the site's sacred significance is much older. The figures and reliefs in question are located in one of the temple's crypts, hidden deeper inside the structure rather than out in the open on the main walls. That detail matters because it is one of the reasons the image feels secretive even before anyone starts theorizing about it. The reliefs were created by Egyptian artisans working under the Ptolemaic temple system, carving within an Egyptian religious tradition that had already been old for millennia. They were not amateurs. They were producing sacred, coded, highly formal temple imagery. And in one of those crypt scenes appears the image that launched 1,000 conspiracy theories. A long oval form. Inside it, a serpent-like figure. Below it, a support or pillar-like base. Around it, priests or attendants appearing to handle or present it. To modern eyes, it looks startlingly like a giant glass bulb. That is the hook. And once people saw it that way, the ancient technology theory almost built itself, because the comparison feels immediate. A bulb, a filament-like form, a support system, a chamber away from daylight. To ancient alien theorists and lost technology believers, this is not a symbolic image at all. It is a depiction of electrical lighting. Some say the Egyptians had access to advanced knowledge, perhaps inherited from an older civilization. Others push further and suggest this was technology introduced through contact with something non-human. In that reading, the Dendera crypts preserve an image of a working lamp, hidden inside a sacred context, because the knowledge behind it was rare, powerful, or never meant for public use. That is why the relief became so famous. It does not require much imagination to see the comparison. It looks like a device. And once that thought arrives, it becomes difficult to make the image go back to being ordinary temple art. The mainstream explanation is much simpler. Egyptologists generally interpret the scene as religious symbolism, not technology. The oval form is often read as a sacred container or lotus-associated form. The serpent is linked to divine emergence, especially in relation to Egyptian cosmology and creation symbolism. The pillar beneath, often called a djed, is a well-known ancient Egyptian symbol associated with stability and the god Osiris. That is the standard explanation, and it is the accepted one. But even with that context, the image still lingers in the modern mind, because once you have seen something in ancient Egyptian stone that looks uncannily like a light bulb, the question doesn't disappear. It just changes. Not, did the Egyptians definitely have electricity? But why does a ritual relief from a temple crypt look so much like a piece of technology the ancient world should never have known how to imagine? If the Dendera relief looks like a machine, then the dog figurines look like something even stranger. Not a device, a being. Small, human-shaped figures from ancient Japan that, to modern eyes, can look uncannily like astronauts in suits. The dog figurines come from prehistoric Japan, most commonly associated with the Jomon period, which lasted from roughly 14,000 BC to 300 BC. The most famous examples belong to the late Jomon and final Jomon phases, especially between around 2000 BC and 1000 BC. That alone makes them remarkable. They are not from an imperial state, not from a literate civilization with monumental temples, but from a very ancient culture of hunter-gatherers and early settled communities. The Jomon people were among the earliest pottery makers in the world. They lived in villages, created complex ceramics, and left behind a surprising range of ritual and artistic objects. The Dogu are among the most famous of those objects. They have been found across different parts of Japan, especially in the northeast, including sites in regions such as Ahomori, Iwate, and Hokkaido, though examples appear more broadly across the archipelago. They are usually made of clay, often small enough to be held in the hand, and shaped in highly stylized human-like forms. And that is where the mystery begins. Because some of these figurines do not look like simple human idols at all. They have oversized heads, large, rounded or goggle-like eyes, broad torsos, segmented limbs, markings and patterns across the body that to a modern viewer can look less like decoration and more like seams, armor, padding, or a suit. This is why the dog became so important in ancient alien theory. Because unlike many ancient images, they do not need much explanation before the reaction kicks in. To some viewers, they look like little astronauts, or beings in protective gear, figures dressed for an environment different from our own. And once that comparison lands, it becomes hard to ignore. Ancient alien theorists seized on the dog for exactly that reason. They argue that these are not merely stylized ritual figures from prehistoric Japan. They are representations of visitors, non-human beings, or perhaps humans in technology so advanced that ancient people could only represent it through clay and exaggeration. The goggles become helmet visors. The markings become suit details. The body shape becomes protective equipment. In that reading, the dog are not symbols. They are memory. A prehistoric culture recording the appearance of something it had actually seen. That is the strength of the alien reading. It is visual, immediate, and difficult to shake once it hits. The mainstream explanation is much more grounded. Archaeologists generally interpret Dogu as ritual or symbolic figurines connected to fertility, protection, healing, spiritual practice, or community belief. The exaggerated eyes, limbs, and body markings are usually understood as stylization, not technology. Some figurines were intentionally broken, which suggests they may have been used in ritual acts rather than as portraits of real beings. That is the standard reading, and it is the accepted one. But even with that explanation, the visual strangeness remains, because the dog do not look like ordinary human figures. They look distorted in very specific ways. And when those distortions line up so neatly with modern images of goggles, suits, and otherworldly beings, the old question comes back. Not, were the dog definitely aliens? But, why do prehistoric clay figures from ancient Japan look so much like something from a space-age imagination? If the dog figurines look like astronauts in clay, then the cave paintings of Tassili look like something even stranger. Not small figures held in the hand, but giant beings painted across stone. And some of them look uncannily like they are wearing helmets. Tassili is a vast plateau region in southeastern Algeria, deep in the Sahara Desert, near the borders of Libya, Niger, and Mali. Today it is dry, rocky, and remote. But thousands of years ago, it was a very different world. During prehistoric times, this part of the Sahara was far wetter and more habitable, with grasslands, lakes, and animal life that could support human communities. That is the world in which the paintings were made. The rock art of Tassili spans a huge time range, with different phases usually placed between around 10,000 BC and 2000 BC, though exact dating remains difficult. What is clear is that these are very old images, produced by prehistoric peoples living in a landscape that no longer exists in the form they knew. The art includes scenes of cattle, hunters, ritual life, animals, and human figures. But among those images are some of the most controversial figures in ancient alien theory. The most famous is often called the Great God of Sephar. It is a large, round-headed figure with what looks, to modern eyes, like a helmet or visor. The body appears strange, stylized, almost floating. Other figures from the same broad tradition also show enlarged heads, odd proportions, and forms that seem less like ordinary human beings than masked or suited entities. That is why Tassili became such a powerful chapter in the ancient alien argument. Because here, the images do not just look symbolic, they look non-human, or at least non-ordinary. To ancient alien theorists, the interpretation comes quickly. These are not simply ritual dancers or stylized humans. They are beings in suits, helmeted visitors, entities from the sky remembered by prehistoric artists and painted into stone. The Sahara, in that reading, was not just a habitable ancient landscape. It was a stage for contact, a place where early humans encountered something they could not fully understand and tried to record it in the only visual language they had. This is why the great god image became iconic. Like Palenque, it is visually unforgettable. Like the Dogu, it feels immediately alien to the modern eye. And once that reaction sets in, it becomes very hard to look at the figure as merely ordinary prehistoric art. The mainstream explanation is much more grounded. Archaeologists and rock art specialists generally interpret the Tassili figures as part of ritual, symbolic, or ceremonial prehistoric art traditions. The large round heads may represent masks, headdresses, body paint, trance imagery, or stylized spiritual figures, rather than literal beings. The strange proportions are usually understood as artistic or religious exaggeration, not realism. That is the accepted reading. And as with the other chapters, it is not a weak one. Prehistoric art often does distort the human form. It often blends ritual, symbolism, and altered states into visual expression. But even with that explanation, the images still produce the same effect, because some of them do not simply look stylized. They look unnervingly modern in the wrong way. A giant round-headed figure, a visor-like face, a body that feels suited, masked or sealed off. That is why the Tassili paintings remain so powerful. Not because they prove anything, but because they trigger the same reaction every time. How could prehistoric people paint something that looks so much like a being in a helmet? And if the answer is ritual, why does the image still feel so uncomfortably close to the idea of an astronaut? If Tassili gives you giant painted figures that look like they are wearing helmets, then the Camonica petroglyphs give you something even more unsettling. Figures cut into stone that to modern eyes can look less like ancient people and more like beings in suits. Camonica is a long alpine valley in Lombardy, northern Italy, in the Italian Alps. It is one of the most important rock art regions in the world. Across the valley, thousands upon thousands of carvings were cut into exposed rock surfaces over immense stretches of time. The imagery includes hunters, warriors, animals, ritual scenes, weapons, symbols, and human forms. The carvings were not made all at once. They belong to multiple phases of prehistoric and protohistoric life, with some of the earliest examples dating back to around the 8th millennium BC, and later phases continuing through the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and into historical periods. That matters, because Val Camonica is not a single mystery image. It is a vast visual archive created by different peoples over thousands of years. And inside that archive are certain figures that ancient alien theorists keep coming back to. Why? Because some of the human-like carvings appear to have oversized heads, radiating shapes around them, or forms that look almost mechanical. In a few of the most famous examples, the figures seem to wear something like helmets, with lines or emanations around the head that many people say resemble visors, antennae, or some kind of energy field. To a modern viewer, especially one already primed by science fiction and astronaut imagery, the effect is immediate. They do not just look like ordinary prehistoric humans. They look technological. And once that idea lands, the ancient alien reading arrives quickly. These, the theory says, are not symbolic tribal figures at all. They are depictions of visitors, helmeted beings, entities observed by ancient people and then carved into rock with the only visual language available to them. In that reading, the radiating lines are not decorative. They are part of a suit, a helmet, or some kind of advanced equipment. And because Val Camonica contains so much rock art across such a long time span, theorists argue that it could preserve repeated memory of contact rather than one isolated event. That is what gives these petroglyphs their power in this subject. Not just one image, a broader field of strange figures embedded in one of Europe's richest prehistoric art landscapes. The mainstream explanation is much simpler. Archaeologists generally interpret the unusual Val Camonica figures as symbolic, ritual, or stylized human forms within prehistoric artistic traditions. The helmeted look may be headdresses, masks, solar symbolism, or exaggerated anatomy rather than technology. The radiating lines around some heads are often understood as expressions of power, status, ritual significance, or sacred imagery, not machinery. That is the accepted view. And, as with the other chapters, it is a strong one, because prehistoric rock art all over the world often stylizes the body, enlarges heads, and surrounds important figures with non-literal signs. But even with that explanation, the visual problem remains, because to the modern eye, some of these carvings still look startlingly like suited beings. Not all of them. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to keep the question alive. And that is why Val Camonica still matters. Not because it gives the strongest evidence for ancient aliens, but because it shows how little it can take for ancient symbolic art to start feeling uncannily modern. A carved figure, a strange head, a set of radiating lines. And suddenly, the image stops looking prehistoric and starts looking like something from far beyond its time. So once again, the question is not whether the carvings are real. They are. The question is why some of them still look so much like figures in helmets, suits, or some kind of non-human gear, and whether that resemblance is only modern projection or another trace of something ancient people were trying to record the best way they could. If the figures at Tassili look like helmeted beings painted across stone, then the Wandjina figures of Australia may be some of the most visually striking of all, because at first glance, they do not look like ordinary human figures at all. Large round heads, dark eyes, no visible mouth, pale faces ringed by forms that, to modern eyes, can look almost like helmets, halos or sealed suits. That is why they were pulled into ancient alien theory so easily. But to understand them properly, you have to begin with where they come from. The Wandjina images are found in the Kimberley region of northwestern Western Australia, especially in rock shelters and cave sites across the lands of Aboriginal peoples, including the Warora, Ngarinyin, and Woonambal cultural groups. This is one of the oldest and richest rock art regions in Australia. The Wandjina are part of a long-standing sacred tradition, not a random prehistoric curiosity. Dating the images precisely is difficult, as it often is with rock art, but the Wandjina painting tradition is ancient, with many examples believed to be at least thousands of years old. And importantly, the tradition did not simply vanish into the past. These figures remained spiritually meaningful, were maintained, repainted, and passed through cultural memory over generations. That matters more here than almost anywhere else in this video. Because in Aboriginal tradition, the Wandjina are not mystery beings in the modern speculative sense. They are powerful ancestral creator beings tied to country, weather, law, rain, and life. They are sacred, and the images are part of that sacred presence. That is the real foundation. But to a modern outsider, especially one already primed by science fiction or ancient astronaut ideas, the visual shock is immediate. The figures do not look naturalistic. They often have large, rounded heads, broad shoulders, and huge dark eyes. Most striking of all, they usually have no mouth. That absence alone has made them unforgettable to modern viewers. Why would a figure be painted so powerfully, and yet without a mouth? Why do some of them look so unlike ordinary people? And why do the pale head shapes feel, at first glance, so eerily close to modern images of alien beings or helmeted entities? That is where the ancient alien reading enters. The theory says these are not only spiritual figures, but memories of contact. Visitors, non-human beings whose appearance was so unusual that ancient people recorded them in the only visual language they had. In that reading, the large heads, dark eyes, and smooth facial forms are not symbolic. They are observational. The Wandjina become another example of ancient people, depicting beings that looked as if they came from somewhere beyond Earth. That is the claim. And visually, it is easy to understand why people make it, because the images are so distinctive that they seem to leap across time. They do not look like armored warriors. They do not look like kings on thrones. They do not look like ordinary tribal portraits. They look otherworldly. That is exactly why this chapter is so powerful. The mainstream explanation, and more importantly, the culturally grounded one, is very different. To the Aboriginal communities connected to these traditions, the Wandjina are creator beings and spiritual ancestors. Their form is part of a sacred symbolic language, not evidence of extraterrestrials. The lack of a mouth, for example, is often explained within the spiritual framework of the tradition, not as a biological or technological clue. The images are meaningful because of what they are within that culture, not because they resemble modern alien archetypes to outside viewers. That is the key point, and it is the point that has to be respected. Because unlike some of the other chapters in this story, this is not simply an ancient puzzle waiting for modern theorists to project onto it. It is a living sacred tradition that already has its own meaning. That is the accepted and respectful reading. But even with that clearly stated, the visual force of the images still remains, because modern eyes still react the same way. Large heads, dark eyes, strange, almost sealed faces, figures that feel less human than they should. And that is why the Wandjina remain one of the most controversial examples in the ancient alien conversation. Not because they prove the theory, they don't, but because they show how powerfully visual resemblance can pull people away from cultural context and toward cosmic speculation. So once again, the question is not whether the images are real. They are. The question is why sacred ancestral figures from ancient Australia still strike so many outside viewers as looking like beings from somewhere beyond Earth, and whether that reaction says more about the images themselves or about the way modern people have been trained to see the unknown. What makes these images so difficult to dismiss is not any single carving by itself, not Palenque alone, not Abydos, not the Vimanas, not the Dogu, not Tassili, not Camonica, not the Wandjina, because any one of them, taken alone, can be explained away. A coincidence, a symbolic image, a mistranslation, a trick of erosion, a modern mind projecting modern ideas backward onto ancient stone. And sometimes that may be exactly what is happening. But when you place them side by side, something else begins to happen. The question gets bigger, because now you are no longer looking at one strange object in one strange place. You are looking at a pattern, images scattered across the ancient world, across cultures that did not share language, did not share empire, did not share oceans, and in many cases did not share even the same millennium. And yet the same broad shapes keep returning. A figure seated like a pilot, a being that looks less like a god and more like an astronaut, a machine-like form. A flying craft in the sky, a helmet, a visor, a sealed body, a radiating head, a figure that appears less human than it should. That is where this stops being only a debate about archaeology, because once repetition enters the story, the human mind starts asking a much deeper question. How are people separated by such enormous distance, able to imagine things that feel so strangely similar. How does one culture carve a king who looks like he is operating a craft, while another leaves behind images that seem to resemble aircraft? While another tells stories of vehicles moving across the sky, while elsewhere, figures appear in stone, clay, or paint, looking as if they are wearing suits, masks, or helmets. It is the spread of the pattern that gives the mystery its force. Mexico, Egypt, India, Japan, Algeria, Italy, Australia. Different continents, different climates, different religions, different eras. And still, certain visual ideas seem to keep circling back. That alone does not prove alien contact, but it does create a pressure that is hard to ignore, because there are really only a few broad possibilities. The first is coincidence, that these images only seem connected because the modern eye is desperate to connect them. That human beings, regardless of where they lived, produced symbols, masks, ritual figures, and sacred imagery that by chance now happen to resemble modern ideas of astronauts, pilots, and machines. That is possible. The second is that these civilizations, though separated by distance, were all expressing very human themes in very human ways. Power, divinity, flight, transformation, the heavens, the unknown above. And because all human beings look at the sky, dream about what is above them, and give supernatural force to things beyond reach, they ended up producing similar symbolic forms. That is also possible. But then there is the third possibility, the one people return to because it is the most unsettling of all, that these cultures were not only imagining, that somewhere behind all the symbolism, all the ritual, all the mythic language and all the stylization, there may have been a common source, not shared by writing, not passed through global communication, not spread by modern media, but seen, something observed, something remembered, something that appeared in one form or another in front of ancient people across the world, and was then translated into whatever visual language their own culture could sustain. Not a photograph, not a blueprint, a memory, a carved memory, a painted memory, a sacred memory. And that is the possibility that keeps ancient alien theory alive. Not because it is proven, but because the pattern is so difficult to make feel ordinary once you have seen enough of it. Because even when every individual case has its own explanation, the broader recurrence still hangs in the air. Why does the same sort of imagery keep surfacing? Why do so many of these forms seem to converge around the same ideas? Sky beings, flying craft, helmeted figures, mechanical-looking structures, human forms in poses and contexts that feel strangely technological. Maybe the answer is that the modern world has contaminated our reading of the past. Maybe once helicopters, astronauts, visors, aircraft and spacecraft entered our visual memory, we became incapable of looking at ancient art without imposing those things onto it. That may be true. But that still leaves one very uncomfortable reality. The comparison works. It works often. It works fast. And it works across cultures so distant from one another that the visual echo itself becomes part of the mystery. That is what makes this subject so powerful. Not certainty, not evidence strong enough to close the case, but resemblance. Persistent resemblance. The sort of resemblance that, once noticed, follows you from image to image. One carving, one figurine, one painted figure, one old text, then another, until a person looking at the ancient world starts to feel as if the same strange face, the same strange machine, the same strange presence is peering back from multiple civilizations at once. That is where the real force of this story lies. Not in proving that aliens were here, but in asking why the ancient world keeps producing images that seem to suggest they were. And perhaps the strangest part of all is this. These images do not survive because they are easy. They survive because they are unresolved. If the debunks were fully satisfying, the mystery would die. If the ancient alien theory were fully proven, the debate would end. But neither of those things has happened. Instead, the images remain exactly where they have always been. In tombs, in temples, on stone, in caves, in crypts, on mountain walls, in desert shelters, in the memory of cultures that gave them meaning long before the modern world arrived to reinterpret them. And still, they keep doing the same thing. They keep making people stop. They keep making people look twice. They keep making people ask the same impossible question. What if they really were seeing something? What if these were not just symbols of gods, death, kingship, ritual, weather, or mythology, but fragments of one deeper encounter, broken apart and preserved in different forms across the ancient world? That is the possibility no one has ever fully been able to kill, because once you lay these images across the globe, and across time, and across civilizations that should never have been able to influence one another in any simple way, the pattern stops feeling local. It starts feeling planetary. And that may be the most unsettling thought of all. That the ancient world did not produce one isolated mystery. It produced many. And somehow, across all that distance, they keep pointing back toward the same shape, the same sky, the same otherness, the same impossible suggestion. That long before the modern age, long before rockets and satellites and science fiction gave us a language for things beyond Earth, someone, somewhere, may already have been trying to describe them.